Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back. So we went off and exercised our powers and practices of the humanities, and now we're back to kind of talk about some of what came out of the how-to sessions and where to go from here. And with us, we have Michael Bérubé, who's the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities and the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of Literature at Pennsylvania State University, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera America, and other outlets. And then Cathy and Davidson is the Ruth F. DeVarney Professor of English and John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Duke University. And she is also the co-founder of Haystack. That's the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory. So welcome to you both. So the idea is just for you to engage in conversation. We have about 20 minutes. So Michael, why don't you start us off? You were heading up, you were the facilitator for the How to Be Heard Beyond the Academy how-to session, and what came out of that?
Well, I'm pleased to say that our session fixed everything. As of 11 o'clock, we were universally valued, and hence, Diane could make that announcement. I'll just reprise very quickly the problem as I set it out, following from Dick Broadhead's remarks this morning, and I'll turn things over to Cathy in a way I hope that is baton passing. No sooner did the heart of the matter get released this summer, right, than David Brooks, who was on the committee, wrote that column about the decline of the humanities. Now, those of you who've read the report know that it speaks nowhere of decline. And it proved to me, as I was saying a little while ago, that in some sectors of the public, you cannot utter the word humanities unless the word decline is also in the sentence. And that is, in all seriousness, part of the challenge of initiating these discussions is that when we leave this room, we do so almost inevitably on the defensive. Now, there are a couple of ways to deal with that, one of them which I think Dick mentioned this morning. The first is simply to look at, return our attention to the monuments and artifacts of the humanities from the caves of Lascaux forward. They are among the most valuable and amazing things ever done by our species, but if you lead with that and you end with it, you wind up with a discourse that is appreciating or celebrating the humanities and nothing more. Not that they don't need to be appreciated and celebrated. Widening that circle would be great, but there's something more that needs to be said. Dick's argument was more to see the humanities as powers and practices of ordinary life, which I think is entirely right and just and necessary way to see things, because as a matter of fact, unless you have some sense of the intellectual and creative capacity of humans and some access to that range of human expression, you're going to find it very difficult to navigate the world in which we live. But neither of those arguments, I think, gets to another question, which is, why should there be specialized research in the humanities? Why should there be specialized knowledges at all? Why do we have this whole new class of PhDs? The monuments and artifacts are there themselves. We reinterpret them. We create new ones every day, being the species we are. But why research in them? And doesn't this rhetoric of justification inevitably set at a discount everyone from the French medievalists to the difficult to understand post-colonial post-structuralists whose work is not going to circulate very widely beyond fairly small disciplinary and intradisciplinary circles. So how to make the case for the humanities without, while also giving a space to the idea that the humanities can, as C.L.R. James said of cricket, be a game of high and difficult technique, that require years of study. Whereas an Aikido instructor once said to me, look, the first 30 years are just practice. And the idea of seeing the humanities as a sort of lifelong learning, that's, again, right and just and necessary, but it leaves open the question as to why there should be a class of people doing new research into the humanities. My own suggestion, and I got this partly from Jeff Harpham, is that if we understand the humanities in terms of monuments and artifacts, we inevitably see them as a repository of wisdom, not as creating new knowledge the way the STEM fields do. They create new knowledge, they create products, they understand new things about the universe. We don't create new knowledge in quite the same way. And there is no such thing as new wisdom. Wisdom is old. And so we find ourselves in a conundrum when we try to justify the more esoteric aspects of what we do. However, I have the funny feeling that a lot of this has changed because of certain new technologies that I think Cathy might want to.
Is this my turn to take the baton? My session was on doing the, I think it was called doing the digital humanities right. And we actually expanded the topic. I presented with Patrick Jagoda. I don't know if Patrick is here. Patrick Jagoda is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. He's one of the editors of Critical Inquiry. So Patrick not only writes about hypertext and writes about contemporary literature, he runs a program with Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Medical School having to do with games and using games to explain health, social justice, and other kinds of outcomes in the city of Chicago. And Patrick and I really expanded the idea of digital humanities to something we were calling, quoting Mark Surman, the CEO of Mozilla, the people who make the Firefox browser, digital literacy with a maker spirit. And I think there's something about that as a specialization which actually has applications not only to all of the humanities, but I'm going to say very, very boldly, as I did in the last session, to all of higher education in 2014. The argument I was making is that much of the metrics and the apparatus of our contemporary university, semesters, graduate school, professional school, tenure, grades, multiple choice tests, statistical methods, ways of measuring outcome were actually invented. They do not go back to the ancient Greeks. It's not true the academy has not changed since the Greek academy. They really go back to the period from about 1860 to 1925, where the American liberal arts university was systematically remade to be more industrial, more European, more vocational. And this was done, it started through the land-grant universities, it started through the founding of Johns Hopkins, the first research university in America, and it starts through Charles Eliot, who was president of Harvard for 50 years and was determined to remake the clerical, what he considered the clerical and pastoral training of Harvard for the businesses and competition the world needed at Harvard during that time period. I think in some ways, digital literacy, digital humanities are the Johns Hopkins University of our era, that they're a test case and a model, not again for the humanities, but for all of the university. Why? They bring together basic specialized work in the humanities with very specialized work in computation. This is something that most of our universities don't even know how to talk about together. And certainly society isn't very good at thinking about computation, visualization, sonification, all of the different online technologies that are very much a part of our lives and that we carry in the palm of our hands with our smartphones as part of the humanities as well. But in fact, the two of them in the digital humanities have been coupled together for massive and monumental projects that we can all go to, Wikipedia being the most obvious one, right? The largest encyclopedia the world has ever created. Why? By making an open platform to which people can contribute actually quite specialized knowledge and which rather persnickety editors can edit according to the Archivist of America, to standards as high now as many of our other generalized sources that aren't contributed through crowdsourced public contribution. That to me is a model for the next generation of the university and for the way that in this world where since 1993, which is when the Mosaic 1.0 browser was unleashed upon the general public, anyone who had an idea had the ability to instantaneously communicate that idea to anyone else in the world with an internet connection. That's an insanely powerful and scary human capability, right? At least as important as steam power was to the creation of the research university and to the assembly line was the creation of the modern research university. I think we have to be thinking about the ways to recreate the university for this world where we all have a power that we've come to in 20 years that we've barely begun to think about. You know, what are the mechanisms we need now? I believe digital humanities scholarship is one way of showing that, in fact, the divisions and the silos of the university not only should or can be traversed, but are being traversed. We are an object lesson in the ways you can take computation and the humanistic traditions and put them together as very specialized knowledge, but also in new ways. So it's not just even, I agree completely, wisdom seems so much in the past. It's not just, it's also by presenting technology with the challenges of everyday human life and human culture, it pushes the technology. In other words, if you're talking about things like security, privacy, surveillance, identity, right? Access. Those are all kinds of issues that are very important to what we do in the humanities, not just to cultural studies, but to anything that has to do with archives. Right? All of those issues have to do with archives. They're tremendously difficult technologically, aesthetically, by design, by technology. The social scientists have to be involved. Dealing with the issues of our everyday post-1993 life requires a different kind of specialized research across the university. And I'm going to just say the humanities should be leading that change. Most computer science departments act as if the internet isn't invented yet. In fact, most of the kind of code you need to power the internet is not taught in most computer science departments. I'm talking about a transformation that is not just the humanities. I think the humanities can be the leader for a university that needs a massive rethinking right now.
Michael, so I mean, it's interesting in the session that we had, that kind of issue of the role of the university, or the next university, as Cathy has been talking about, came up again, and looking at what it has been and how there's this kind of, maybe not bifurcation, but between that specialized research you were talking about, that esoteric discourse, and then this transmission, teaching. What would you say in response to what Cathy said about where the university needs to go next, and how humanities leads that next iteration?
Well, the first thing I would want to say back is that I wouldn't want to confine this, that discussion only to the university. I think it has implications, it has obvious, incredible implications for how the university is organized, but it also has even more staggering implications for the transmission of knowledge more generally. I like to say, and therefore I will, that too often when we think of humanists, either with regard to the sciences, I'm going to specifically talk about bioethics in a moment, or with regard to new technologies, we show up too late. We show up as color commentators. And I think of Leon Cass in Bush's bioethics panel back in 2002. This is the stem cell panel, handing out copies of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark to his fellow commission members. And that idea, or Huxley's Brave New World, has given us the image of humanists as people who come along to new technologies basically going, cut that out. I wouldn't do that if I were you. You're going to regret that. When as a matter of fact, as my colleague Susan Squire says, we should actually be taking credit for the idea of IVF. In vitro fertilization, as conceived by Robert Edwards, and for which he got the Nobel a few years ago, and of course the first test tube baby was 1978, that was thunk up by humanists in various ways, not just dystopian, but in very imaginative and creative ways as well. And so I like to think whatever new technology, whatever new development comes along, humanists should be there on the ground floor. In fact, sometimes we already are, and we don't acknowledge that. With regard to new technologies that Cathy's talking about, again, the idea is not to come along as befuddled end users, but actually be part of the architecture and the creation of how these things operate. Cathy knows much more about that specifically than I do, and I think Haystack is.
I don't understand. We're sitting quite still, but
I know.
it's very
you know what
active.
It is?
The machine is
I think Haystack is a harbinger of things to come in this regard. There is fracking going on in Pennsylvania. There are people who, and elsewhere, and people who ask me, well, what is the Institute for the Arts and Humanities? What kind of programs do you have about this? And as a matter of fact, we have a bunch. For one thing, quite apart from the issues of fracking itself, we've seen this before. Oil, coal, steel, timber. There's a long history of labor and resources in Pennsylvania, and we should put this in context. We should always historicize the fracking, quite apart from the question of, well, who gets taxed and where the money goes and so forth and so on. And someone said to me, really, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities is going to do rocks now? And I said, as long as humans interact with the rocks, we're talking the humanities now.
So, the next university, or maybe no university, is that what you're saying, Michael?
Next, any extra?
Cast your, look broadly for where you're going to intervene or be a part of the conversation, part of the development of technology, lay claim to the ideas where you have, in fact, been a part of the discourse. You talked about IVF, but what else? What would you challenge? What's the challenge you would give people as we wrap up today? Go forth, what are the things that people should do in terms of bringing humanities forth, making it a more prominent player in the kinds of conversations and the things we're doing in the world?
I think one thing we need to do is not only to do the kinds of public actions on behalf of the humanities, and maybe even, I mean, one problem, I'm on the National Council for the Humanities, it's the body over the National Endowment for the Humanities, and one thing we always say is the word humanities is a real stumbling block. My dad's a scientist and he thinks I do humanitarian aid. He doesn't, the word does not have the same resonance as history, literature, the arts, all of the specific things that collectively make up the humanities. So we have one semantic issue to get over, and maybe the word isn't the humanities. Maybe we just need to be talking about the kind of work we do and describing what that work is. Although I guess if you're a branding expert, you would say I just said a really stupid thing, so maybe we have to change. On your chairs today, there was a little postcard for an initiative that the organization I'm involved with, Haystack, which is an open community that anyone can join for free, is doing worldwide, starting now, on the future of education. And we're using online tools to get ideas about what people are doing, what students, faculty, administrators within the academy are doing now to rethink the most relevant, engaged, specialized, important, respectable, responsible research the world needs now. Why I think that's so important is a lot of the media has been saying over and over again that there are no ideas in the academy, that you need CEOs and venture capitalists to come up with big ideas, that we are incapable of coming up with those ideas ourselves. In our session, we did a little exercise where people wrote ideas that they're doing at their institutions right now on cards and shared those, and I'll be putting those up online later on. In one room, dozens of ideas of vital, interesting, engaged ideas are happening. So some of it is that we're not only thought about as in the decline, we're often thought about as being too stodgy to come up with new ideas. So this project that we're doing with higher education is partly to say, hey, we have a lot of ideas. Now, please bring your venture capitalism to us, and we'll see what we can do for dividends for society. What would happen for the real dividends for society.
The people who complain that we're not creative enough are sometimes the same people who complain that we're the domain of outlandish ideas that make no sense. And so in response to that, and this is really bad branding, but I'll say it anyway, I say that, no, but we are the departments of making stuff up. If you want some sense of the intellectual and creativity, the intellectual and creative breadth of humankind, that's basically our domain. And yeah, it does have actually applications to capital. I was going to go in a different direction though. Because the area I know of the intersection of the humanities and elsewhere has to do with disability studies, has to do with bioethics, has to do with the medical humanities. And there is where, what I say about, we shouldn't come to these things as befuddled end users, I'm talking sometimes about reproductive technologies, about screening, things like that, where I don't want humanists to come in late, after the thing's already has been designed, with a certain number of values intact and inherent in a technology, and then we come in, like I say, as color commentators, and proclaim, these things are good or bad. On the contrary, when we're talking about that intersection of bioethics, disability studies, and the medical humanities, we are quite literally talking about matters of life and death, debility and disability, and these are this is something that affects actually every single one of us over the course of our lives. And so there too, the idea that these things should be segregated by discipline or even by special interdisciplinary centers where this work gets done and no place else seems to me anathema to the calling of the humanities.
Well, we'll leave it there. Cathy, Davidson, Michael Bérubé, thank you so much for that summation. And I think Clark Hulse is going to wrap us up today.
Thank you, Cathy and Michael and Alison. I trust each of you has your takeaways from this. Indulge me for, I think, 3 quick minutes while I give you mine. What I've heard today and what we need to do next. It's time to stop. It's not time to stop talking. It's time to combine our talk about vulnerability and risk in the humanities with positive action. I know we won't stop talking. We shouldn't stop talking. We're great at talking, but it's time to start doing. Which means it's time to stop worrying about a crisis created by others. And it's time to focus on how we want to practice the humanities now and in the future. As a professor, I study the humanities and I profess the humanities, and much of what I do is quite solitary in very, very delightful ways. But as a practitioner of the humanities, I'm not alone. I'm part of a much larger group that includes a very, very high percentage of humanity. Every time someone reads a novel or tells a story, every time someone studies history or records it in the making on their smartphone, every time one of us tries to understand someone from another culture or to understand a whole society, contemplates music or the visual arts or the slant of light across a building, they are practicing the humanities. A lot of people don't study the humanities, but nonetheless do the humanities all the time. And these practices can be carried out with more or less discipline, more or less rigor or profundity. As Michael pointed out, these practices range from the most generalized to the most specialized, but I think they're all as instinctive, as innate to being human as our adding or subtracting or doing calculus or bioengineering. If the realm of our practitioners is indeed large, not a subset of us gathered competitively around the department laser printer, then we have to be ready to communicate with that larger public, with clarity, with precision and rigor that are the hallmarks of the best writing and speech in the humanities. Did I mention clarity? And we must be willing not only to speak, but also to listen, to learn from the humanities practices and humanities knowledge that is everywhere outside the universities. Learning from others, listening to them carefully, and being willing to challenge our own opinions is the true standard of engaged knowledge and of humane learning. And it's something that I've had to do in my own public humanities activity. It's a kind of humbling of one's identity as a professor. And my next point, it can be a tricky one, but our panelists have alluded to it. Are we willing to articulate, defend, and revise commitments that we might call moral or ethical, but that are humanistic and rooted in the study and practice of the humanities? Are we willing to overcome our highly refined academic skepticism about value statements and re-explore those very tricky links between humanism, humanitarianism, and the academic humanities? Links that Lisa Jardine and Tony Grafton point out have been fragile or missing, since about the year 1430 or about 6 seconds after the creation of the academic humanities. So, what happens next? We need to spread the message internally about the richer and more rewarding life of ideas that waits just outside the ivy walls. This is the coalition of the willing, need to work to connect more deeply, even more deeply than we are now, with non-university groups or institutions. As Dick Broadhead reminded us, we are already in our institutions of higher learning in every community. It's there. We just need to reach. We need to tell our story. In some, we need to practice, practice, practice. At Chicago Humanities Festival, we will continue our practice, and we welcome others to join us. This coming autumn, CHF will launch its 25th annual Fall Festival here in Chicago. We'll partner with Diane Harris and the 15 research universities on the University Without Walls project. We will put together a summary of your discussions and recommendations from today and distribute them to you and beyond, and we will look for partners to help carry out the ideas from today. But I want to conclude with this. Here's what I'd really like to see. The running theme of the heart of the matter and of today has been the need for cooperation and coordination across all sectors of humanities practice. I'd like to see us take up that challenge and build an effective national coordination among museums, festivals, state councils, the NEH, public libraries, university humanities centers, all the rich and glorious groups that are practicing the humanities piecemeal and pull together to really make the case for the humanities to show what we do and why it's such a good thing that we do it. It's time, in short, to move from pathos to parity. Thank you.